Thanks for coming along tonight, folks, where Tom Gilling makes a first appearance at the Sydney Institute. He's the author of The Dangers of Kapyong, The Diggers of Kapyong, the story of the Aussies who changed the course of the Korean War, which is recently released and it's on for sale tonight. I'll introduce him. So the topic of the talk is the Battle of Kapyong, Australia's decisive role in the Korean War. And I'll introduce him briefly as an acclaimed novelist and non-fiction writer. He's written 2 novels. They were both New York Times notable books of the year, and his non-fiction works include Bastard Behind the Lines and The Lost Battalions, and he's also co-author with Clive Small of best-selling true crime books, Smack Express, Blood Money, Evil Life and Malat. You're mixing good circles, gee.
I didn't interview him.
Yeah, didn't interview them. Well, that's good. And tonight, the topic, again, the Battle of Kapyong. Tom Gilling, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. When the US journalist and author David Halberstam was researching The Coldest Winter, his monumental book on the Korean War, he visited a library in Florida where he found 88 books on Vietnam and only 4 on Korea. A disparity, he wrote later, that more or less sums up the war's fate in American memory. Halberstam's book, which he subtitled America and the Korean War, runs to more than 700 pages. Turning to the back, I couldn't help noticing the 17-page index jumped from Austin John to Ayers Eben without a single reference to Australia's involvement in the war. But it was not only in America that Australia's role in the Korean War has been played down. Here in Australia, the war began to be forgotten while it was still being fought. After being wounded in the Korean War, evacuated to Japan, and then sent back to rejoin the fight, Signal Sergeant Jack Galloway returned to Australia in February 1952. The war had been raging for more than 18 months and had more than a year to run. Galloway recalled walking into hotels where I met old friends who said, "Where have you been?" And I said, "Korea." And they said, "What the hell were you doing over there?" Some Korean War veterans remembered being rebuffed by RSL clubs because that wasn't a proper war. Inevitably overshadowed by the 2 world wars that preceded it, the Korean War was one of the landmark events of the 20th century, a product of Cold War machinations whose outcome remains bitterly contested to this day. In January this year, more than 70 years after the war ended, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un declared South Korea his country's primary foe and invariable principal enemy, telling the Supreme People's Assembly that North Korea would no longer pursue reconciliation with South Korea and putting an end to the decades-long pursuit of a peaceful reunification. It was Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, who started the war, sending North Korean troops and tanks across the 38th parallel on the 25th of June 1950. Within hours, it was clear that the badly trained and poorly equipped South Korean army was facing catastrophe. With Russia boycotting the United Nations, North Korea ignored a UN resolution calling for an end to the fighting and the immediate withdrawal of its troops. When the UN called for contributions to an American-led multinational force to repel the communist invaders, Australia was among the first nations to respond. The Americans were hopelessly unprepared for war. Since 1945, President Harry Truman's priority had been paying off America's $250 billion wartime debt. In 5 years, he pruned the defense budget from 38% of gross domestic product to less than 5%. In that time, the number of American servicemen and women fell from 12 million to 1.5 million. Hardware was not modernized, and munitions were left to run down. The armed forces were left undermanned, undertrained, and under-equipped. In just a few years, they had become a shadow of the fighting machine that had defeated the Japanese in the Pacific and the Nazis in Europe. In early 1946, Australia sent 3 battalions, around 10,000 soldiers, to join the US-led occupation force tasked with disarming and demilitarizing post-war Japan. Much of the diggers' time was spent on ceremonial duties and when war broke out in Korea, the Australians were nowhere near combat ready. They lacked vital weapons and equipment and were desperately short of transport. During the First Korean War, the diggers were reduced to scrounging warm sleeping bags from dead American soldiers. Before arriving in Korea, Jack Galloway, like many of his mates, thought of the war as a sideshow to what seemed like an inevitable confrontation with the Soviet Union. He was right about Australians going into battle against a communist superpower, but the adversary would be Mao's China, not Stalin's Russia. The Royal Australian Navy and the Royal Australian Air Force both played significant roles in the Korean War. But during the most intense period of the conflict, most of the hard fighting was done on the ground by soldiers of the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment. Of the handful of fierce battles fought by 3RAR during the Korean War, none was more crucial to the war's outcome than the Battle of Kapyong. It was here, in a rugged valley north of Seoul, that 3RAR and a battalion of Canadian infantry, supported by New Zealand artillery and American tanks, perhaps 3,000 men in all, were given the job of halting the Chinese spring offensive. For the diggers, it would be the defining battle of the war, the ultimate expression of Australian military skill, determination and courage. That it happened on the eve of Anzac Day only added to its significance. After the Battle of Kapyong, 3RAR would be awarded the rare honour of a Presidential Unit Citation by US President Truman in recognition of its extraordinary heroism and outstanding performance. But the battle's importance went far beyond the bravery and skill of the diggers who fought it. The 7-kilometre wide Kapyong Valley was a traditional invasion route for armies marching south towards Seoul. It would have been difficult for a brigade to hold, which is 3 battalions, Galloway recalled later. If the Chinese had poured through Kapyong, they would have been behind the capital of Seoul, behind all the major headquarters of the United Nations Army, and the result probably would have been a withdrawal of the United Nations Army from Korea. Before the battle, 3RAR had been in reserve in a picturesque part of the Kapyong Valley the Australians called Sherwood Forest, more than 30 kilometres from the front. The diggers were badly in need of a rest. They had spearheaded MacArthur's advance up the peninsula and fought as rear guard for the Americans when the UN Army was driven back. The 23rd of April, the battalion's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Alf Argent, recalled, was a beautiful warm day with clear blue skies. War seemed a long way off. But for the disintegration of the 6th South Korean Division above them, the diggers would never have been called upon to make a stand at Kapyong. As terrified South Korean soldiers poured south to escape the Communist Army, the Australians were ordered to occupy high ground overlooking the north-south road. Private Keith Langdon, in a forward foxhole on Hill 504, described seeing South Korean soldiers, a mob of them, throwing their guns and rifles and even uniforms to buggery. Pursuing the South Koreans were 10,000 Chinese soldiers belonging to the 60th Infantry Division. 2 companies, a few hundred men in total, were posted astride the road. Major Ben O'Dowd's A Company on Hill 504 commanded the road from the east, and Captain Darcy Laughlin's B Company on a ridge dominating it from the west. 2 more companies were positioned further back on Hill 504. Holding the summit of Hill 504 was crucial, since losing it would enable the Chinese to fire down on the Australians occupying its western slope and jeopardise the diggers' ability to control the road. While the ground held by B Company on the western side of the road was suitable for digging, other areas were too rocky. Some men were able to squeeze into crevices or take cover between rock formations. O'Dowd's company had to make do with piling up loose stones for protection from enemy fire. The low heather scrub covering the slope was tinder dry from the bitter Korean winter. There was little sense of urgency or impending danger among the diggers as they took up their positions on the evening of the 23rd of April. The information they had received from their commanders was that they should settle in for a quiet night before either developing defensive positions where they were or moving forward. They had done this many times without firing a shot. Private John Beresford recalled being told "There's nothing to worry about. We'll be moving first thing in the morning, so just dig your pit and have tea and that'll be it." One of those missing from the battalion was Jack Galloway, who had had a lucky escape after the 3-ton truck he was travelling in broke down. The damaged truck was towed away by an American Sherman tank with a crane on its back. "We tore off down the road until we came to a bridge that wouldn't take the weight of a Sherman tank," Galloway recalled. "The Sherman didn't hesitate. He went straight down over the side of the road, with the truck trailing behind him on its side, and all of us out on deck. When the truck overturned, Galloway was crushed under a heap of signal wire, suffering serious damage to his back. Evacuated to a Swedish hospital in Korea, and then to a British hospital in Japan, he would miss the Battle of Kapyong, but not its aftermath." As darkness fell on the night of the 23rd of April, the road was crowded with fleeing South Korean troops, refugees, and a growing number of Chinese infiltrators, whose aim was to isolate the diggers on the western side of the road from the 3 companies on Hill 504 before circling to attack the battalion HQ area. The sight of a South Korean division in headlong retreat, casting off brand new American weapons, clothing, and equipment as it went, was nothing new to the diggers. They'd seen the same thing happen on New Year's Day in response to an earlier Chinese offensive. Following a well-practiced routine, the Australians checked their weapons, laid out spare ammunition and grenades, and waited. Before long, a full moon rose in the sky, flooding the valley with white light that enabled the diggers to see for hundreds of meters. At around 9:30 p.m., the Chinese launched their first attack against 5 American tanks on the valley floor. Despite the lack of infantry protection, the tanks beat off their attackers before withdrawing to prearranged positions in front of Laughlin's company. By now, heavy fighting had broken out in the battalion HQ area. This coincided with a second and much more determined Chinese attack against the American tanks. Once again, tank commanders had to direct fire from open hatches, with their heads and upper bodies exposed to sniper fire. Within minutes, the commander of each tank was hit by rifle fire. The platoon leader was shot between the eyes and killed. The only way to get the Chinese infantry off the tanks was for the tanks to close their hatches and hose each other with machine gun fire. An initial assault on Laughlin's position was driven off with heavy losses to the enemy, the diggers able to pick off targets easily in the bright moonlight. These encounters were clearly the prelude for a full-scale attack aimed at throwing the Australians off the high ground on both sides of the road. Failure to achieve this before daylight would leave the Chinese troops on the valley floor exposed not only to a deadly barrage by US tanks and artillery, Australian mortars and Kiwi gunners, but also to bomb, rocket and napalm attack from the air. The attack on O'Dowd's company followed a pattern the Australians recognised all too well after their 10 months in Korea. A flurry of bugles and whistles as enemy commanders assembled and organised their men, followed by silence as the Chinese soldiers crept up the hill in their noiseless rubber shoes. The clatter of grenades hitting the rocky ground before exploding, and finally the infantry assault as Chinese soldiers rose up in the moonlight, machine guns blazing. A single-shot rifle was not much use in close-range fighting like this, and the diggers' preferred weapon was the Australian-made Owen submachine gun. Though sturdy and reliable, the Owen fired low-velocity 9mm bullets that did not always penetrate the thickly padded uniforms worn by the Chinese. After each attack, wounded diggers were removed to the reverse slope where the medic, Corporal Nobby Clark, and his stretcher bearers did what they could for them, while fit men rushed to occupy the vacant weapon pits. Casualties did not seem to concern the Chinese, who surged forward over the bodies of their own dead and wounded. A steady Chinese mortar barrage of both high explosive and incendiary bombs continued throughout the night, the latter setting fire to the dry heather. The combination of thick smoke, burning heather, and exploding ammunition caused further misery for the wounded Australian soldiers lying out in the open. The next attack against Laughlin's company came at 3:30 a.m., when Chinese soldiers struck from 3 sides. Despite the presence of 2 Sherman tanks, The Chinese succeeded in penetrating the company's perimeter and attacking the company headquarters with rifle and machine gun fire before being driven off with the loss of as many as half their strength killed. O'Dowd's position on the eastern side of the road remained precarious. His company suffered 50 casualties that night, holding its ground against wave after wave of Chinese attackers. As he did the rounds of the hill, Corporal Pat Knowles was amazed at the drag marks, blood, cotton wool and bandages where the Chinese had dragged their dead and wounded away during the night. With PRC troops infiltrating behind his position, O'Dowd was unable to evacuate his casualties. The medics could only treat wounded men with what they carried in their bags. They had nothing to relieve pain, no morphia, no effective means for averting shock, except for a few blankets and sleeping bags, O'Dowd recalled. Most of the wounded had to lie all night on the frozen hillside without shelter. Dressings for wounds ran out and there was no water. While lying there, some of the injured men were burnt by fires started by Chinese incendiary rounds. O'Dowd was not alone in believing that if it had been possible to keep the wounded warm and treat them for shock and pain, some who died that night might have survived. By daylight, it was clear that the Chinese had failed in their efforts to push the Australians off the ridge. But O'Dowd knew that if the diggers could be dislodged from the summit of Hill 504, his own depleted troops would be unable to hold. This time, the Chinese would not wait for darkness. Every digger on the hill knew what was coming. It was my 24th birthday on the 24th of April, which was the second day of Kapyong, and I didn't think I would see another one, Sergeant Ron Perkins recalled. At around 7 a.m., the Chinese launched their first assault against the summit. The same pattern of attack was repeated by the Chinese every 30 minutes until 10:30 a.m., each assault beaten off with machine gun fire and grenades at heavy cost to the enemy. With dozens of wounded soldiers awaiting evacuation, 3RAR's New Zealand-born commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Ferguson, called the medic, Captain Don Beard. He said, "I've arranged with an American tank regiment for a squadron of tanks. We'll go up there with ammunition and see if we can get the casualties out. Will you come with me?" Beard recalled. I didn't want to go because I'd only just got out of the battle. However, of course, I said, "Yes, sir." As soon as they spotted the tanks moving up the valley, the Chinese started firing. Inside the tanks, Ferguson and Beard listened to the clatter of bullets striking the turret as they trundled towards the battalion's position. But on the return trip, a remarkable thing happened. The Chinese guns fell silent. The tanks made several trips with wounded diggers strapped to their sides, and each time the Chinese held their fire. O'Dowd's men had been hoping the tanks would bring grenades and ammunition for their Owen submachine guns. What they received instead was high-velocity ammunition for the heavier Vickers machine guns, which soon stripped the barrels of their rifles and Bren guns. As for food, water, and medical supplies, the diggers on the hill would have to do without. Only the promised arrival of the 5th US Cavalry Regiment convinced O'Dowd that his men could hang on. But by early afternoon on the 24th of April, news reached brigade headquarters that the Americans would not be coming after all. The diggers had been abandoned to their fate. Convinced that 3RAR would not be able to survive another night of Chinese attacks, the commander of the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade, Brigadier Brian Burke, decided to withdraw the Australian battalion. Aware that he was responsible to the Australian government for the safety of its battalion, Burke knew that searching questions would be asked if the only Australian ground force in Korea were wiped out at Kapyong. Sometime after midday, Ben O'Dowd recalled, the commanding officer came on the air to advise me that there was a chance that there was no relief coming our way, and I had approval to take a shot at getting the rifle companies out. While Norm Gravener's D Company clung to its position on the summit, O'Dowd got to work planning a fighting withdrawal along a route that, for all he knew, might already have been blocked by the Chinese. Timing was critical. The enemy had had all day to observe the battalion's actions, and O'Dowd considered it an absolute certainty that they would renew their assault after dark. The likelihood of being pursued along the ridge by the Chinese led O'Dowd to adopt a leapfrog-style withdrawal, in which one company stood its ground, while another prepared to fall back, and the third moved. New Zealand gunners were to keep the Chinese at bay with a barrage of smoke and high explosive. Some of the diggers were reluctant to abandon their positions. A few members of D Company felt they were holding on all right and demanded to know why they were being ordered to pull out. But with ammunition running short, staying on was impossible. Just before 4 p.m, O'Dowd told B Company to begin its withdrawal. The other companies were waiting for the Kiwi gunners to open up. 4 o'clock came and went with no guns firing. The wind had changed direction, meaning the smoke shells had to land on a different spot to be effective. Unwilling to wait while the New Zealanders retargeted their guns, O'Dowd instructed Reg Saunders' C Company to get moving. Next to go was A Company, led by O'Dowd's second-in-command, Captain Bob Murdoch. As Murdoch prepared to move out, a platoon of American tanks lurched into position in the valley and started firing at the Chinese across the road. Shortly afterwards, the New Zealanders began their barrage, some shells landing dangerously close to the American tanks and forcing at least one to back off. With C Company and A Company positioned behind D Company to discourage follow-up by the enemy, Grosvenor was ordered to pull out. The Chinese, however, had chosen this moment to launch another attack on the summit, making it too risky for D Company to break contact. After beating off the attack, Grosvenor began thinning out his troops, helped by accurate fire from the New Zealanders, whose shells at times exploded no more than 150 metres forward of the diggers. According to Grosvenor's battle report, this ferocious barrage completely frustrated enemy attempts to follow up further, enabling D Company to get away. As the Chinese started to stream down the hill, the New Zealand artillery got the lot of them, Private Ron Dunk recalled. Bang, bang, bang. I saw the whole front row disappear. By 11:30 p.m, the withdrawal, described in the official history as difficult and brilliantly executed, was completed at a cost of just one man captured. Australian casualties for the two-day battle were 32 men killed and 59 wounded. The text of the Presidential Unit citation made clear the significance of 3RAR's achievement. The seriousness of the breakthrough on the Central Front, it said, had been changed from defeat to victory by the gallant stand of these heroic and courageous soldiers. With the Australians gone, it was the turn of the 2nd Battalion of Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, 4 kilometres to the west on Hill 677, to face the advancing Chinese. Shortly after midnight on the 25th of April, the Chinese attacked the battalion's left flank. Like the diggers the previous day, the Canadians were isolated and exposed to enemy attack from all sides. In danger of being overrun, the Canadians had no choice but to call down artillery fire on their own positions. This action, together with a counterattack by American tanks, eventually caused the Chinese attack to falter and enabled the Canadians to hold on. The next day, the US 5th Cavalry Regiment made its belated counterattack, but the Americans were driven back. It would be several weeks before the UN forces were back in control of the Kapyong Valley. Between them, 3RAR and the Canadians had fought an entire enemy division to a standstill, buying time for General Van Fleet to reorganize his army and halt the Chinese advance north of Seoul at what became known as the No-Name Line. A nearly simultaneous battle between the advancing Chinese and the British 29th Brigade demonstrated what might have happened to the diggers had the battle played out differently. Like Brigadier Burke at Kapyong, the commander of the British 29th Brigade had been assigned a sector too broad to cover with the manpower he had available. The Chinese attacked across the Imjin River around midnight on the 22nd of April, exploiting a gap between the 1st Battalion of the Gloucestershire Regiment and the 1st Battalion of the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers. Over 2 days and 3 nights, the encircled and outnumbered Gloucesters fought off waves of Chinese attackers. Efforts to relieve them failed, When it proved impossible to resupply the Gloucesters and evacuate their wounded by air, they were given permission to break out if they could. Just 39 soldiers rejoined the brigade. The rest were either killed or captured. The battalion's total casualties were more than 600. The Gloucester's doomed but courageous stand was credited with enabling the rest of the 29th Brigade to make an orderly withdrawal to a new line above Seoul. By then, the Chinese spring offensive had stalled and the capital was safe. Jack Galloway rejoined 3RAR in time to bury the dead at Kapyong. After the war, he wrote a history of the battalion's Korean campaign. Although he had missed the battle, Galloway knew how it had been fought. It wasn't a battle where influence could have been brought to bear by great tactics or by brilliant officers, he said years later. It was simply a matter of digging in, holding on by your teeth, and fighting literally to the last man and the last round, and that's what they did. After the Battle of Kapyong, the Korean War lapsed into stalemate. While the front lines remained relatively stable during the final 2 years of the war, Australian soldiers continued to fight and die. In October 1951, 3RAR lost 20 men killed and 89 wounded at the Battle of Mariang San, part of a United Nations offensive against a Chinese salient. Over 5 days of heavy fighting, the diggers pushed a larger enemy force from a strongly held position on Hill 317. After the Australians were withdrawn, the Chinese retook the hill and kept it for the remainder of the war. The killing stopped when the armistice came into effect at 10 p.m. on the 27th of July, 1953. But the war did not end. It left behind a legacy of mutual antipathy, distrust, and fear between North Korea and South Korea, marked by periodic border skirmishes, kidnappings, espionage, and other provocations. The number of military incidents across the peninsula jumped from 42 in 1965 to nearly 300 in the first half of 1967. In January 1968, with war raging in Vietnam, 31 North Korean Special Forces soldiers infiltrated the South with orders to kill the South Korean president. The plot was uncovered, and all but 2 members of the assassination squad either committed suicide or were killed. After one of the North Koreans surrendered, he was deemed a defector by Pyongyang, and his parents and siblings were executed. In the same month as the botched assassination raid, an American spy ship, the Pueblo, was attacked and boarded off the North Korean coast. The crew were captured and held in North Korean prison camps for nearly a year, where they were subjected to various kinds of torture and abuse before being released. 2 decades later, North Korean agents detonated a bomb aboard a civilian airliner bound for Seoul, killing more than 100 passengers and crew, most of them South Korean. The motive for the bombing was allegedly to discourage visitors from attending the 1988 Seoul Olympic Games. In 2010, a South Korean naval ship was sunk by a torpedo fired by a North Korean submarine. More recently, after years of diplomacy aimed at reducing tensions on the peninsula, the outlaw regime in Pyongyang revived its nuclear and ballistic missiles program, ramping up its anti-Western rhetoric and demolishing the Inter-Korean Liaison Office in the border town of Kaesong. As the 70th anniversary of the armistice approached in July 2023, a senior UN official lamented the fact that tensions left by the Korean War persist and remain unresolved even after 7 decades. During the previous 18 months, North Korea had test-fired 90 ballistic missiles, making a mockery of a UN resolution prohibiting it from conducting any launches using ballistic missile technology. Russia and China, the regime's long-term friends on the Security Council, ensured there would be no repercussions. Since then, the bellicose rhetoric from Pyongyang has escalated still further. Kim Jong-un's recent assertion of perpetual enmity with South Korea was a stark reminder that while North Korea signed an armistice with its neighbor, it has never made peace, which now seems further away than ever. Anna Fifield, Asia-Pacific editor of the Washington Post and author of The Great Successor, the secret rise and rule of Kim Jong-un, believes we should all be concerned by the legacy of an unfinished war that has led to the creation of an impoverished totalitarian state with a credible nuclear weapons program. While the two Koreas have coexisted in an uneasy standoff for the past 70 years, Fifield argues that Kim Jong-un's latest comments are more than the usual bluster. His calculations seem to have changed, and he'll take a whole bunch of unprecedented steps, not just changing the constitution, but destroying monuments to unification and testing new nuclear-capable weapons. With the US distracted by the Ukraine and Gaza conflicts, Fifield warns that Kim Jong-un could sense an opportunity to launch some kind of attack. That might be shelling out of South Korean islands, as his military has done before, or something more provocative, she says. He appears to be almost girding for a fight. So where does that leave Australia? Fifield believes that the instability caused to the region by the unfinished Korean War and the prospect for conflict, international or otherwise, remains tangible, and that this could have real economic and security implications for Australia. If South Korea, a big economy and major trading partner, is embroiled in a war, that will affect our trade routes and supply chains, she argues. Australia, as a security partner of both the United States and South Korea, could once again be called to fight on the Korean Peninsula. And as a country that believes in democracy, Australia has an interest in defending a democratic nation against an authoritarian one, just as it's doing in Ukraine against Russia. If that were to happen, Australia's political and military leaders would be well advised to look to some of the lessons of the so-called forgotten war we took part in more than 7 decades ago. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom Gilling, for a terrific presentation. It has very much been the forgotten war, so it's very important to put it in order and tell us about it. Now we're coming to questions and discussion. If you just speak to the end of the room. I'll just start off by asking you, towards the end of your talk, you talk a lot about North Korea right at the end, but what's missing from the front of the talk is virtually no reference to North Korea. So China, as you know, always says they've never invaded a country, but the modern China says that. What you're talking about is a full-out war of the Chinese trying to take Seoul in South Korea. So what role were the North Koreans playing in that part of the war at Kapyong? Or was it all run by China?
The massive inflow of Chinese troops, the massive inflow of Chinese troops by that time had meant that they were really commanding the fighting and therefore also the strategy. They had given very good warning to the whole world that they would intervene if it looked like MacArthur was going to take the UN troops all the way up to the Chinese border. MacArthur knew that, and he insisted on taking his troops up to the North Korean border. It shouldn't have been up to the Chinese border, sorry. It shouldn't have been any surprise to anyone that the Chinese did what they had warned that they would do, and they duly did it.
Thank you. Just following on from Gerard's point, and toward the end of your presentation, you talked about being aware of what North Korea is doing and could do. Where do you think China would stand should any of those threats come to fruition? And can you also talk about the influence of the Taiwan issue and whether that has any influence on North Korea?
Look, I think China is activated like most countries by self-interest, and one of its key concerns is what would happen if hostilities broke out in Korea. What would happen with refugees flooding across the border? That would obviously influence any decision it made, I suspect, on how it would intervene and if it would intervene. I would see Taiwan as a far more pressing issue for the Chinese, because they've stated very clearly that they see reunification as essential and inevitable, and for the dignity of China. So that seems to me something that's a more imminent concern than what they might do in Korea.
Hi, Tom. I'm fascinated by what the troops were like, because you say we forgot the war happened, we weren't so involved personally as a country, the average person. These boys, men, whatever they were, was about 10 years from the beginning of the Second World War. Were they former troops in the Second World War? Were they new to the game? They're fighting in territory that is so vastly different from anything they would have had in the Second World War, freezing mountainous slopes rather than jungle, whatever. Can you tell us about the sort of blokes that were there fighting? Because they obviously showed an enormous amount of resilience plus cunning to do what they did, to survive and win the battle.
Absolutely. No, they were, as I said, many of them had been in Japan living a very cushy life for 6 years. And none of them wanted to leave. If they could have stayed for another 10 years in Japan as occupying troops, they undoubtedly would have. But many of them were veterans of the Second World War, and when Australia made a commitment for 10,000, when Australia made a commitment to go to Korea, it was very important that many of those troops had been fighters largely in the Pacific, but also in Europe. They were very experienced and tough soldiers. They weren't young men, they weren't new recruits. And I think that was central to the fact that the Australians, being underprepared, under-equipped, were able to perform so effectively. They were whipped into shape in quite short order when Charles Green took over the regiment, first in Japan and then when he took them over to Korea. By then, in that relatively brief time of intensive training, he'd got a pretty strong battalion to deal with. But I think the point you make that they were actually largely veterans of the Second World War. They'd come back to fight because they saw communism as a threat, but also because they probably enjoyed being soldiers. And if they'd been raw recruits and young fellas, then they might have been much less capable of handling the conditions that they met.
What was the involvement of the Liberal government? As I understand it, I think the commitment was probably made by the Foreign Minister rather than Menzies, the Prime Minister, that we would send forces to Korea. But it seems odd that nothing much was spoken about it during the 1950s. Did any ministers visit the battlefront?
Yeah.
Well, tell us about that.
Frank Ford, who I think was the Minister for War, was that right? He went up and visited the troops. Menzies had been desperate to go and visit the troops, but it was MacArthur's call as to whether or not he would be allowed there, and MacArthur vetoed it. He let him come up, I think, to Japan, but he wouldn't let Menzies go to Korea to visit the Australian soldiers there.
Was it just MacArthur being MacArthur, or what was it?
Yeah, it was MacArthur being... Well, I think it would have been... If things had gone wrong and something had happened to Menzies, it would have been very awkward for MacArthur, and he was a man who gave diktats, and he did in that case, and I think it frustrated Menzies no end.
Thanks, Tom. A great speech. It sounds like a well-managed battle which had a number of different forces in play. So who was in charge of the overall battle strategy? Was it an Australian? Was it American?
Brian Burke, it's certainly not an American, no, but Brian Burke, as the commander of the British Commonwealth Brigade, had overall charge, but he was given a difficult hand. As I mentioned, he was given an area to defend, and knew that he had far too few troops to do that job. So the gaps between his forces were greater than he would have liked. he was promised American support late in the battle, but it didn't arrive, as often happened with the Americans. And he was bundled into action in the first place because of the collapse of his allies, the South Koreans in particular. But the Americans it was not unknown for them to move pretty smartly backwards as well. So it was Burke who coordinated the brigade. Ferguson was in command of the Australians. But really, the most important officer there was Ben O'Dowd, who was the senior company commander, but he was the man on the spot. Ferguson's headquarters was quite a long way back, and he moved in the course of the battle further back. So really, the success of Kapyong was largely to do with the leadership of Ben O'Dowd.
You mentioned Jacqueline. I've got a Zoom question here from Bill in Melbourne. He says, I wonder if you came across something interesting about Wilfred Burchett's activities in the Korean War. He was an Australian-born, died in communist Bulgaria. In the Korean War, he was on the other side. He was on the North Korean side. He participated in interrogating Australian POWs and gave them enlightening talks about how wonderful the Socialist Soviet Union was. So he was a controversial figure. He wrote a history of North Korea. He had a history of Korea, which was very supportive of the communist Korea. He wrote books very supportive of communist regimes in Eastern Europe. But he had this involvement in Korea. Now, it's not related directly to the battle you're writing about, but did you come across him in your work?
Well, I read about Burchett. Naturally, he's a very controversial figure, but he was pretty controversial and not welcome to the Australian prisoners he spoke to at the time. So the Australians, many of the prisoners, they were very reluctant to fall into the hands of the North Koreans. They tended to fare better where they were taken by the Chinese, but life was pretty tough in both cases. But they tended to be, they resisted the indoctrination, the propaganda that was fed them, I think, pretty effectively and pretty vigorously. Yes, Burchett made his efforts to turn some of them, or to convince them that the United Nations was engaged in germ warfare by dropping germ bombs on the North Koreans. I think a lot of people saw through him. I think he was controversial there as well as at home.
Getting back to the description that you gave about the actual battle, which I have to say is quite riveting, it was like being in a movie, really, wasn't it? We were all following each move as you took us up and down that hill. But tell me, were there any legacies from that battle? Are there any enduring military legacies that are taught in in the military schools?
You mean in terms of the tactical?
Yes,
lessons?
I do. Yes.
Look, I think it's together with Mariang San, it's the most important battle from Australian point of view of the Korean War, and the performance of the Australians there is venerated, and the Kapyong Day is celebrated every year by Australian Defence Forces, by the Army, at any rate. So I think there's no doubt that it was a greatly respected performance. Whether they could draw any tactical lessons from a battle in the 1950s to what happens now, I don't know. But certainly it's something that the 3rd Battalion will always be very deeply proud of.
There's a bit of competition on the Korean War. I went looking before this talk about the Battle of Kapyong, and various countries sort of pushed their barrow. Did you find a lot of that when you were doing your research? That you said that the Vietnam War way outdid the Korean War in terms of publications.
Yeah.
But how do we do in terms of the American view of who won the war and the English view or the New Zealand view or the... I mean, it seems to me that sometimes Australia just gets left out if it's an American
Most
record.
of the time. I
Yeah.
think it gets
Can you
left
give us
out
a
by the
bit more
Americans.
on
Yes,
that?
I think
about,
if
it's important.
It is important. It is important, and I think in a sense it's understandable because the Americans had far more troops there. They clearly did the lion's share of the fighting by virtue of their size, but they also probably had the lion's share of the disasters, and Australia fought well above its weight there, but is neglected or ignored altogether, I think, in some American accounts. You certainly find mentions of the Kapyong, sometimes quite detailed mentions in the official American history of what happened, but it's a tiny fraction of the overall coverage, American coverage of the war. And I think there is, it's not just at Korea, I think in Vietnam as well, there's a strong sense that if the Americans are involved, then the Americans think only they're involved. After all, they did win the Second World War as well. So I think, yeah, I think it's true though. I think Australia's right. That's why it's important to write about it in Australia, because if everyone else is downplaying our contribution, we need to acknowledge it ourselves.
I've got a Zoom question here. So, was the Reg Saunders you mentioned the famous Indigenous officer?
It was, yes.
And a follow-up question: why do you think it would be, therefore, that his involvement in Korea isn't talked about all that much? You've mentioned it tonight, obviously. It's in your book, but he's not mentioned all that much, according to our questioner.
Possibly he's not. I mean, he didn't become a senior officer, but he was an extremely capable company commander, and he shocked the Americans. There's a passage in the book where I talk about some Australians meeting an American who said, "Are you taking orders from him? Are you taking orders from that black man?" And they said, "Absolutely. I mean, to us, he walks on water." And the Americans couldn't believe it. There was still a lot of racial tension in their army. But yeah, I mean, if you Google Reg Saunders, then you know, quite a lot has been written about him. He's a much admired figure, but I suppose there was a limit to how high he became, and that probably affects how much he's been written about.
Is there any Korean consciousness of the Australian contribution in particular at this battle? But how widely known is our contribution in Korea?
Look, I can't answer that question actually. I know that that American presidential citation was given to the Australians. There was a Korean presidential citation went to, I think, the Canadians, so to even things out. But yeah, it would be interesting to know whether there's a sense in Korea about Australia's involvement there that could match the sense in France, for example, of Australia's involvement in the First World War.
I'll just make a comment there. Prime Minister Morrison, I think it was a visiting Prime Minister from South Korea, came out a couple of years ago. It was well remembered Kapyong then.
Was it?
It was the night we had our annual dinner, and the Prime Minister arrived, and he told me, I mentioned Kapyong, and he said, "Oh, we've just been talking to the South Korean leaders." So I think it is quite noted in South Korea, yeah, particularly when they come to Australia.
Yeah.
There's a question here.
Tom, thanks very much indeed for the clarity of your talk. You mentioned that there's instability still exists from the lack of resolution from the Korean War. Now, as we look at North Korea, it seems a very impoverished and weak nation indeed. And it raises the question, why doesn't South Korea take over North Korea?
It's an interesting hypothetical, isn't it? I mean, I think it would be calamitous if it happened, but it's interesting to speculate. I don't imagine the Chinese would stay out if it did happen.
So I've got another Zoom question here, which I suppose takes up the speculation, but looking backwards, not speculation forward. Why did the Chinese not continue to pursue the battle? I mean, you talk about the spring offensive, it ceases, so that's the northern spring, right? So why did China had a lot of forces? Why did they not pursue?
China had almost limitless human resources, but America by the time, by Kapyong really, or after Kapyong, was by that time able to pour in enough equipment and weaponry to mean essentially that the United Nations forces couldn't be defeated. The United Nations forces always held command of the air, and that was only going to increase. So really, China was only, I think, recognising the inevitable, just as the United Nations forces had to, that they could not defeat China, but China was not going to be able to push the UN forces out. There had been a time when MacArthur had to very seriously consider the prospect of having to evacuate the peninsula and go back in, evacuate the peninsula because they were driven out, and then bide their time, build up forces and go back in, which would have been no doubt vastly expensive in casualties. But that was certainly, plans had to be drawn up for that, because the UN forces early in the war were very close to being pushed right off the peninsula. But by late 1951, it was becoming clear that neither side could win, and it was then just a question of where the line between would be drawn.
I've got a Zoom question from someone in Brisbane, where MacArthur spent a bit of time in the Second World War.
He
right?
did.
And he's got your book, and noted in the index there are a lot of references to MacArthur.
Mm.
So how do you assess MacArthur's role? He was a controversial figure in the war. He ended up rowing with the president. So looking at it from an Australian point of view, the question is, how did you find MacArthur?
Well, I think MacArthur had shown he was a military genius with the landing at behind the lines, which turned the course of the war in 1950. But he was an ideologue too, and he was not given a license to turn the whole Korean peninsula into a democratic state. That was not part of the West's war aims. It was certainly not part of the war aims of the president. But it was MacArthur's vision was that he could achieve that, and that's why he went. He was given quite strict instructions about how far he could take the UN army after pushing the North Koreans out of South Korea, and he continued to the border. And as we spoke about before, the Chinese had already made it very clear through various back channels that they would intervene if the UN got all the way to the border, and so they did.
I've got, I think, I call it a slightly irreverent question from a woman in Hobart, who says to us, or to me to ask you, what's better fun, writing about real wars or real crime?
Writing about real crime is probably more fun, but I think writing about real wars is probably more important.
So just finally, this book, anything else in mind? In the military sense, or back on crime?
I think there's lots of battles in other wars where Australians have played a big part, which is perhaps insufficiently recognised in the general history of those battles. And so I'm looking at the Desert War in the Second World War, and looking at Australia's role there, which was again very significant. They were greatly outnumbered by the British contribution, but a very significant performance, which I think perhaps hasn't been sufficiently recognised.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks very much to our speaker for a terrific analysis tonight. This is a great book, The Diggers of Kapyong, the story of the Aussies who changed the course of the Korean War. We've got copies for sale here tonight and put it up on our website as well. No doubt your future work will be as impressive as this, and we'd love to have you back.
Thank you.
For tonight, well done and thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerard.
Thank you.